Let us begin slowly, and gently, as though you were stepping into another century, far away in time, and yet curiously close in feeling. Imagine Cairo in the 19th century, a city that was already old, already layered with histories of pharaohs, caliphs, merchants, and travelers. The narrow streets twisted like veins through the heart of the city, and along those winding lanes, among the tea sellers and spice merchants, there were places known quietly, sometimes whispered about, sometimes spoken of openly, the hashish houses. These were not grand palaces, nor hidden dungeons. They were, in truth, modest places, low-ceilinged rooms tucked behind heavy wooden doors, lit by lamps and cooled by shaded courtyards. To step inside was to leave behind the bustle of Cairo's streets, the calls of vendors, the bray of donkeys, the sound of children running, and to enter a slower world, a softer world, where time itself seemed to stretch and bend. The hashish houses were not unique to Cairo. From Istanbul to Damascus, from the small villages of the Nile to the great cities of the Ottoman world, similar places could be found. But Cairo's were particularly famous, and particularly colorful, woven into the rhythms of the city's life. When a person approached such a house, there was rarely a signboard. The door might be plain, perhaps carved but weathered, perhaps painted, perhaps left bare. You entered through a threshold that felt like a border, a shift in air. Inside, the scent was unmistakable, thick, sweet, earthy, with smoke that curled slowly upward, drifting toward darkened rafters. The air was heavy, but not unpleasant. The scent clung to clothes, hair, skin. To sit there was to become part of it. The people who gathered inside were many and varied. Some were poor men, laborers who had spent long hours carrying burdens across markets, lifting stones, rowing boats on the Nile. For them, a few coins might buy a moment's ease, a chance to let their muscles rest, their minds soften, and the weight of the world blur. Others were merchants, wealthier men who had more to spare, who came to talk, to gossip, to exchange stories. And sometimes, there were men of letters, poets, musicians, men who believed that the smoke of hashish could open doors in the mind, could loosen imagination, could dissolve the ordinary. But women, too, were present. In Cairo, as in other cities, there were women who visited these houses, though often separately or in private gatherings. Travelers wrote of them, sometimes scandalized, sometimes fascinated. Women from different walks of life might appear, entertainers, singers, dancers, and sometimes wives who sought an escape from domestic confines. For them, the experience was a rare loosening of bonds, a rare freedom in a society that kept many restrictions. The setting was simple. Mats or cushions were spread across the floor. Men and women sat in loose circles. Low tables might hold cups of coffee, tea, or water. Lamps flicker. Step once more into the shaded rooms of Cairo, where the walls whisper with smoke and the lamps burn low. The city outside, with its markets and mosques, continues its restless rhythm, but here, in these modest houses, time slides into a slower current. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the steady hum of voices, soft and unhurried, the notes of an oud string plucked in the distance, and the occasional rise of laughter, muffled as though wrapped in smoke. The evening begins with arrival. Guests drift in one by one, sometimes two together, sometimes more, but rarely in great crowds. A man pushes open the wooden door, greets the keeper with a nod, and removes his sandals before stepping across the threshold. Another follows, carrying with him the dust of Cairo's streets. Some know each other well and settle into old conversations at once, others come as strangers and sit quietly until a gesture, a shared pipe, or a story draws them into the circle. The room itself is simple. Mats woven from palm fiber, cushions scattered along the walls, a few low tables that hold cups of steaming coffee or glasses of sweet tea. The plaster on the walls may be cracked, the ceiling beams worn with age, but there is comfort in the familiarity. Each visitor knows this space, knows its smells and sounds. They have entered it many times, and each time it offers the same gentle embrace. The keeper begins his work, preparing the hashish with practiced hands. He takes the pressed resin, crumbles it carefully, and mixes it with tobacco, rolling it between his fingers. The clay pipes lie ready. A lamp glows nearby, its small flame steady, casting golden circles of light on his movements. He fills the bowl, places it to the flame, and inhales once to set the ember alive. Then, with quiet ceremony, he passes the pipe to the first guest. It begins like this each night. The first inhalation, deep and slow, followed by a cough or a sigh. The second, gentler, and the third, smoother still. The smoke thickens, drifting in slow spirals. The pipe moves from hand to hand, and soon the room is alive with clouds. It hangs beneath the ceiling like a soft canopy, dimming the lamps, blurring the edges of faces. As the smoke rises, so too does the conversation. At first, it is about the day, the price of wheat in the market, the state of the Nile, the news from Alexandria. A merchant speaks of his caravan, delayed by desert storms. A laborer complains of aching arms from hauling stones. A student recites a story he has heard from his teacher. But as the smoke works its way deeper into minds, the conversation loosens, stretches, bends into shapes less practical, more wandering. The merchant now wonders aloud about fate, about how the desert wind carries news before men do. The laborer chuckles and claims to see visions of palm trees swaying even within the walls of the house. The student quotes a line of poetry, which another completes, and soon verses float across the circle. Step with me once more into the streets of 19th-century Cairo. The air is warm, carrying the mingled scents of spice stalls, roasting bread, and the dust of the desert. Donkeys clatter along narrow lanes, vendors call out their wares, and above it all rises the cry of the muezzin from the minaret, summoning the faithful to prayer. The city is alive, restless, and layered with voices. But hidden within these streets are places where the rhythm slows, where the bustle gives way to quiet, and where time bends into smoke-filled hours. We return again to the hashish houses, those modest, low-lit rooms where men and women sought refuge from the heaviness of daily life. By the middle of the 19th century, these houses had become known beyond Cairo itself. They appeared in the writings of European travelers, in the sketches of curious artists, in the reports of officials. Some accounts were filled with fascination, painting the houses as exotic dens of wonder. Others dripped with moral judgment, describing them as pits of vice and ruin. Yet all agreed on their presence, their persistence, their strange magnetism. Travelers would often describe their first approach. Led by a local guide, they slipped into a quiet alley, where a plain wooden door marked the entrance. To step inside was to leave the world behind. The smoke struck them immediately, thick, sweet, disorienting. They described the dim light, the figures reclining on cushions, the sound of low conversation. Some admitted to partaking themselves, while others observed from the edge, notebook in hand, recording every detail. One traveler wrote of the silence that would sometimes settle over the room, a dozen men seated, pipes in hand, eyes half closed, speaking only occasionally. Another wrote of sudden laughter, sharp and contagious, echoing against the plaster walls until tears ran down faces. Still another wrote of visions. Strange, colorful dreams that seemed to arrive not only in sleep but while waking, as though the very air of the house carried a secret magic. In the eyes of many Europeans, hashish was an emblem of the Oriental other. To them, it seemed mystical, dangerous, alluring, and foreign. Writers like Théophile Gautier and later the members of Paris's famed Club de Hashishins built their own fantasies upon it, imagining Eastern dream worlds filled with palaces and visions. Cairo's humble houses became, in their words, gateways into something vast and mysterious. But for the people of Cairo themselves, these houses were less about mystery and more about habit. They were, above all, familiar spaces. A laborer went not for exotic visions but for the easing of his weary body. A merchant went not for mystical journeys but for companionship and conversation. A musician went to play a song, a poet to share a verse, a woman to steal a moment of freedom. The European gaze exaggerated the strange. The local experience was often simpler, more human. This difference bet we. The story of Cairo's hashish houses in the 19th century is not only one of smoke and song, but also one of tension. For alongside their nightly gatherings of laughter, poetry, and quiet visions, there was always another presence hovering in the background, the watchful eye of authority. Hashish was, at different moments in Cairo's long history, tolerated, forbidden, ignored, or strictly punished. It occupied an uneasy space in society. To some, it was a harmless pleasure, no different than coffee or tobacco, which were themselves once frowned upon and then absorbed into daily life. To others, it was a dangerous distraction, pulling men and women away from their duties, weakening their bodies, and clouding their faith. By the early 19th century, Egypt was under the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, a man both modernizing and authoritarian. He sought to strengthen his grip on the country, to modernize its economy, and to discipline its people. To him and his successors, hashish was not only a social problem but an obstacle to productivity. Fields devoted to cannabis could, in their eyes, be better used for cotton, grain, or other profitable crops. And so, decrees were issued, cannabis cultivation was to be destroyed, its use discouraged, its houses raided. But decrees are one thing, reality another. The Nile still carried fertile silt, and farmers, knowing the demand, quietly sowed seeds in hidden plots. In villages and city courtyards, hashish still grew, harvested carefully, hidden from officials. Traders smuggled it into Cairo, where it passed from hand to hand until it reached the pipes of the city's people. The authorities attempted to clamp down. Police were sent to raid houses, to confiscate pipes, to arrest keepers and guests alike. Travelers of the time tell us of such raids: a sudden pounding at the door, the rush of boots, the scattering of guests. Some slipped away through back doors into alleys. Others were caught, fined, or briefly imprisoned. Pipes were smashed, cushions overturned, lamps extinguished. And yet, within days or weeks, the house would reopen. Why? Because the houses were more than dens of smoke. They were woven into the life of the city. To close them was to try to silence a rhythm that had already become part of Cairo's song. They reopened because there was demand. They reopened because people needed them, laborers, merchants, musicians, women, dreamers. They reopened because in the haze of hashish, the burdens of life felt lighter, if only for an evening. Those who condemned the houses spoke of their dangers. Imams from the pulpits warned that hashish dulled the mind, weakened the body, and turned men from God. Officials argued it wasted time, that it made workers less productive, that it spread idleness. European observers, influenced by their own temperance movements, added their voices, condemning the houses as dens of vice. And yet, those who frequented the houses told another story. To them, hashish wa. Let us continue wandering the quiet, smoke-filled corridors of Cairo's hashish houses, but now, let us turn our attention to the moments when calm was broken, when the world outside intruded harshly into these dens of dreams. For although the houses provided a sanctuary for relaxation, for laughter, for music and quiet visions, they were also places under constant threat. In the 19th century, Cairo's authorities grew increasingly concerned with the spread of hashish, and they launched efforts to stamp it out. Raids, punishments, and public shame were part of this long struggle. Yet despite the dangers, the houses survived, their patrons returned, and the cycle of suppression and indulgence continued. Imagine, if you will, that it is late in the evening. The lamps inside a narrow alley flicker. The stones beneath your sandals are still warm from the day's sun. You hear the distant braying of donkeys, the chatter of vendors packing away their wares, and the faint call to prayer fading into silence. Somewhere ahead, you know there is a house where smoke curls from beneath the door and the soft plucking of an oud drifts into the night. Inside, men and women are gathered, resting after long days, losing themselves in dreams. But on this particular evening, unease hovers in the air. For word has spread that the police have been walking the alleys, and their presence is rarely gentle. The Ottoman authorities, who controlled Egypt through much of the 19th century, had an ambivalent relationship with substances like hashish. On the one hand, they recognized it as part of the culture of the people. On the other, they considered it a vice, a distraction from duty and prayer. Laws existed on the books against its cultivation and sale, but enforcement was uneven. Some nights, the houses were left alone. On others, they were suddenly stormed, the patrons dragged out into the street, their pipes smashed, their supplies seized. Inside the houses, the mood could shift in an instant. A moment of laughter, of storytelling, of deep dreamlike silence, might suddenly be broken by the crash of a fist on the door, or the booming voice of an officer demanding entry. Those inside would startle. Some would scramble to hide their pipes beneath cushions. Others would slip into shadowed corners, hoping not to be noticed. And some would simply remain seated, resigned to their fate, as though the smoke itself had dulled their fear. Picture one such raid. The door bursts open. Two uniformed men step inside, their red fezzes tilted slightly, their long coats brushing against the floor. Behind them, lantern light glares, harsh and unforgiving. The smoke in the room thickens around them, turning the scene into a haze of shapes and shadows. They shout commands. A few patrons are pulled roughly to their feet. Someone protests, only to be silenced by the slap of a baton. The music stops. The house falls into stunned quiet. And yet, as harsh as these moments were, they. Let us return again, dear listener, to the crooked alleys of Cairo in the 19th century, where shadows cling to the walls and the smell of smoke drifts gently through the air. We have already seen how the hashish houses, those dim and hidden refuges, were subject to raids, punishments, and the harsh hand of authority. But as history so often teaches us, culture is not easily extinguished. When one form of expression is suppressed, another finds a way to emerge. And so it was with the world of hashish in Cairo. Though the authorities struck hard, the people adapted, finding in secrecy, in music, in poetry, and in whispered conversation the means to keep their culture alive. Imagine, for a moment, that the lamps have been extinguished, not because the house is empty, but because a raid is expected. The patrons sit in darkness, their whispers low, their laughter muted. Pipes are tucked away, the sweet aroma hidden beneath heavy cloth. Outside, footsteps echo. Perhaps it is only a passerby. Perhaps it is the police. But inside, in that tense stillness, a musician begins to play, his oud strings plucked so softly that the notes seem almost to rise from the silence itself. The music, though faint, fills the room with courage. It tells those gathered that the world outside may be hostile, but here, in the sanctuary of smoke and song, they are safe, if only for a little while. Music became a quiet defiance. Though it could not erase the risk of discovery, it transformed the atmosphere of the houses, turning them into places not merely of indulgence, but of cultural expression. Poets, too, found their voices within these walls. In hushed tones, they recited verses that spoke of dreams, of visions, of the strange journeys of the mind that hashish inspired. One might hear a poem comparing the rising smoke to the ascent of the soul, or likening the laughter of friends to the music of paradise. Such verses, shared in secret, wove a web of community, a tapestry of resistance spun from words rather than weapons. Picture a gathering deep in the old city. A room no larger than a stall, its walls lined with rough plaster, its ceiling low. Cushions are scattered across the floor, worn from years of use. In the corner, a small lamp flickers. The patrons have gathered not only for smoke, but for song. A young man, his robe loosely tied, leans forward with an oud across his lap. His fingers glide across the strings, coaxing from the melodies that rise and fall like the breath of the listeners themselves. Around him, the others sway gently, their eyes half closed, their faces softened by smoke. In such moments, fear of raids melts away, for the joy of shared art is stronger than the threat of punishment. Secrecy itself became an art form. Some houses, fearing discovery, began to disguise themselves as ordinary shops. To the casual passerby, they appeared as small cafes or tea stalls. A pot of tea on the counter, a few cups, perhaps even a tray of sweets. But two. In the long shadows of Cairo's streets, the story of the hashish houses was never one of complete destruction or silence. Crackdowns, edicts, police raids, and public punishments came and went, but the life inside these smoky rooms adapted. People found ways to preserve the rituals that gave them solace, whether through music, whispered poetry, or the quiet passing of a pipe from hand to hand. This chapter drifts into that world of resilience, where every puff of smoke was not merely an indulgence but a small act of continuity in the face of pressure. The city itself, with its tangled alleys and uneven cobblestones, provided natural hiding places. Tea stalls, barbershops, and the cramped workshops of craftsmen became the facades behind which hashish culture endured. A passerby might only see a kettle boiling or a cobbler bent over his leather, unaware that behind a curtain, a group of men and women reclined against worn cushions, their conversations blending with the notes of an oud. The line between ordinary Cairo life and hidden indulgence was thin, almost invisible to anyone who was not part of the circle. Inside these spaces, there was a sense of safety, of shared secrecy. Men weary from long days hauling goods along the Nile, shoemakers with calloused fingers, and students who had slipped away from the stern gaze of their teachers all found common ground here. Pipes were lit quietly, the embers glowing like fireflies in the dark. The air grew thick with the earthy scent of burning hashish, mingling with the aroma of spiced tea. A listener might hear laughter, soft singing, or even fragments of Sufi poetry whispered into the haze. In many ways, this resilience was a response to the human need for companionship and ritual. Cairo's poor, often burdened by endless labor, found a kind of release in these evenings. The act of reclining on a cushion, closing one's eyes, and drifting in thought was not merely about intoxication. It was about claiming a moment of peace. The city outside was noisy, dusty, and filled with demands, but inside the den, time slowed. Pipes were passed slowly from hand to hand, each puff unhurried, each exhale deliberate. Music became central to this resistance of the spirit. The oud and the ney flute, both instruments long beloved in Cairo, carried melodies that floated over the smoke. A single player could hold the attention of an entire room. The pluck of strings or the breath through a reed instrument seemed to mirror the rhythm of inhaling and exhaling. Songs were often improvised, drawing from fragments of poetry or old folk tunes, reshaped in the moment to suit the mood of the gathering. Patrons would close their eyes and sway, their thoughts carried into the haze of smoke as if the sound itself were part of the intoxication. Poetry also endured in these spaces. Many of the verses shared within hashish houses were not written down but spoken, carried by memory and voice. Some came from the mystic traditions of Th. If you walk with me a little further into this wandering story, you will notice that the tale of Cairo's hashish houses is not only told by those who lived within them. It is also told, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with wonder, and sometimes with moral disapproval, by the many foreigners who passed through Egypt in the 19th century. For Cairo, after all, was not a closed city. It was a place of arrival and departure, a hub on the great road to India, to the Sudan, and toward the Levant. It was a city of pilgrims and scholars, but also of European adventurers, colonial soldiers, and wide-eyed travelers who had read too many romantic tales of the Orient before ever setting foot on its narrow streets. Among these visitors, hashish houses became a subject of curiosity. Some came to seek them out with deliberate purpose, others stumbled upon them by accident, and still others only heard of them secondhand, weaving tales based on gossip, rumor, or imagination. Their words, preserved in journals, sketches, and published travel books, form another layer to the history of these smoky rooms. And yet, as with so many things observed by outsiders, what they described often reveals as much about their own desires and fears as it does about the places themselves. Picture, then, the European traveler in Cairo. He is often dressed unsuitably for the heat, a stiff collar, heavy coat, and a notebook always within reach. He has read Burton's accounts of the East, or Lane's detailed ethnography, and he arrives eager to see the Cairo of storybooks, lantern-lit bazaars, veiled women, mysterious music echoing from hidden courtyards. If someone whispers to him of a den where men sit for hours inhaling smoke and drifting into dreams, how could he resist the temptation to see it with his own eyes? One such traveler records his impressions in a hurried script. He speaks of a narrow alley, darker and dirtier than he expected, where a boy led him to a low doorway. Inside, he found a room of perhaps a dozen men, all seated on cushions, their faces softened by smoke. He was struck, he tells us, not by riotous excess, but by a peculiar calm. The men appeared, he writes, as though they had left the burdens of life behind them, their faces serene, their laughter gentle. It is a strange note for a European in the 19th century, for he had expected wild intoxication, madness, perhaps even debauchery. Instead he found stillness. Others, however, cast a harsher judgment. A British officer, stationed in Cairo for only a brief time, wrote home to complain that hashish dens were proof of what he called the laziness of the Oriental mind. To him, the sight of men reclining for hours in smoke was a scandal, a sign that the people were weak, unfit for progress or industry. He did not pause to consider that he himself might drink whiskey or brandy in equally languid fashion at a European officers' club. He did not see that idleness, in different forms, was as much a part of London or